Welcome to The Last Climb. Today let's look at cases where ego set the conditions for mountain disasters long before anything went wrong. From a fraudulent guide with no credentials who was dangerously close to a crumbling wall of ice, to an influencer who made it to the peak, only to trade her oxygen mask for a better camera angle. It was February 14th, 2026. The summit of Mount Everest sits at 29,032 feet above sea level on the border of Nepal and Tibet. Up there, the air has about a third of the oxygen you'd get at sea level, and that morning, the wind was calm for Everest, around 18 miles per hour, making it one of the only usable summit windows of the whole season. Keisha Duvall was 27, chronically online, and absolutely convinced she was built for this. She ran a lifestyle and wellness Instagram, fitness content, travel photos, motivational captions, you know the type. In the months before the climb, she was posting countdowns and sponsored gear shots with captions about how ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Sounds great, right? Except her only mountaineering experience was a guided Kilimanjaro climb the year before, which she actually listed as her primary qualification when she signed up through a budget operator out of Kathmandu. She was on a fixed rotation schedule but skipped her second acclimatization rotation because it was cutting into her posting schedule. Here's the thing about skipping acclimatization on Everest. It doesn't bite you immediately. You feel totally fine. The problem builds quietly until your body gets pushed past a point it was never ready for. Above 26,000 feet, it stops adapting and just starts breaking down. HAP is what happens when fluid fills up in your lungs from that stress. It can hit within hours, and in the early stages you'd have no idea it was even happening. The summit push started at 11 p.m. from Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. Keisha was slower than expected from the start, stopping through the triangular face and the balcony to film clips and check her phone for signal. Her Sherpa flagged the pace twice. She hit the south summit around 7:40 a.m. and the true summit at roughly 9:15 a.m., already 45 minutes past the turnaround time her operator had set. And this is where it all falls apart. Instead of spending the standard 15 to 20 minutes at the top and heading down, Keisha started reshooting her arrival. First take had her oxygen mask on. Didn't like it, covered too much of her face. Second take, wind shifted. Third, hair was wrong. Fourth, her Sherpa was at the edge of the shot. He pointed down the mountain. She waved him off without even looking at him. By take 11, she had been at 29,032 feet for 2 hours and 20 minutes, pulling her oxygen mask on and off between shots like it was a prop. Every time that mask came off, she was breathing air with a third of the oxygen her body needed, over and over, for 2.5 hours. Her total oxygen use at the summit alone exceeded what had been set aside for the entire descent. She started down at around 11:40 a.m. Within the first hour, she was already slowing. By the South Col, her lips had a faint bluish tint, and she had a wet, productive cough, an early sign of HAPE. A teammate suggested calling for support. She said she was fine. She got back to her tent at Camp 4 around 3:30 p.m. and lay down. Her Sherpa gave her the last of the team's oxygen. No Gamoof bag. The operator hadn't packed one. At some point, she picked up her phone and tried uploading content from her camera roll. The uploads kept failing. She lost consciousness sometime before midnight. She was found unresponsive in her tent the next morning. Both cameras were recovered from the tent. The memory cards had 94 video clips from the summit, the last one time-stamped at 11:31 a.m. Her oxygen mask is on in some frames and completely gone in others. Her phone log showed repeated failed upload attempts between 9:20 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. She was trying to post to Instagram the entire time she was up there. Postmortem confirmed cause of death as high-altitude pulmonary edema. Contributing factors included prolonged exposure at extreme altitude, repeated removal of supplemental oxygen above 29,000 feet, insufficient emergency oxygen for the descent, and an incomplete acclimatization schedule that left her physiologically underprepared for the time she spent in the death zone. No distress call was ever made. Her Sherpa had burned through his own emergency oxygen through the night, trying to keep her stable. He was evacuated to base camp with the rest of the team the following day, physically unharmed. The case was ruled death by misadventure. No further investigation was opened. Her operator was not found to be at fault. It was February 14th, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges. Visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience and relied entirely on previous mild-season guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, the body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. It was January 30th, 2026, on a high-altitude glacier approach route toward a remote mountain base region, where a morning freeze had formed a deceptive snow crust that concealed weak bridges above deep crevasse fields. Melis Dorn was 29, a public school counselor from a desert city in the southwestern United States who found comfort in hiking after work. This was her first trek in a high mountain glacier environment, with no intention of attempting a summit, only to reach the base trekking camp and return along the marked route. Her mountaineering experience was limited to supervised training on smaller mountains. While taking a photograph, she stepped slightly off the flagged path, following faint boot impressions in the snow, a choice that would later prove fatal. The glacier surface consisted of broken ice fields covered by soft snow layers. Several crevasse zones ran across the approach corridor, separated by thin snow bridges that could collapse under minor pressure. Clear skies and light wind created comfortable walking conditions, but the overnight freeze had formed a brittle crust that was beginning to soften under morning sunlight. Local guides had previously warned trekkers to remain within the flagged corridor. Old probe holes marked areas where glacier teams had tested snow thickness. A faint side path, created by earlier travelers moving toward a distant ice wall, gradually diverged from the main route. Risk increased when Melis unclipped from a short handline connecting two route markers to move 3 steps rightward for a better camera angle. While adjusting her camera settings, the guide moved ahead with 2 other trekkers, leaving her briefly alone. The warning signs were subtle, with a dull, hollow sound coming from the snow beneath her last step. The surface crust suddenly fractured as Melis shifted her weight, and she fell vertically through a narrow opening in the glacier. Her backpack briefly caught on the crevasse edge, slowing the descent before the strap gave way under her weight. She struck the ice walls during the fall before landing on accumulated snow at the crevasse base. The fall lasted only moments, followed by settling sounds inside the ice chamber. Witnesses above heard a muted impact and drifting snow particles falling through the narrow opening. The guide and trekkers immediately marked the collapse location using root wands and lowered a rope in preparation for rescue. The injuries included pelvic fractures, rib fractures, and facial lacerations. Cold air trapped inside the crevasse accelerated heat loss, and progressive hypothermia developed rapidly. Melis remained responsive for several minutes, though her breathing gradually slowed. The combination of traumatic injury, restricted airway positioning within the narrow ice cavity, and falling core body temperature made survival impossible before extraction could be completed. The guide immediately radioed for help using VHF communication. A rope rescue team arrived after some time and spent additional time assembling a hauling system to extract her from the narrow crevasse opening, as the confined ice walls and limited equipment slowed the process. Extraction was completed after roughly 2 hours. She was first moved to a temporary camp before being carried by litter toward the main trekking staging area. Medical evaluation determined the cause of death to be traumatic asphyxia combined with blunt force injury, with hypothermia and delayed extraction contributing to the outcome. Evidence recovered included the torn backpack strap and a broken camera device, later found resting on an ice ledge about 18 feet below the surface. The incident was briefly discussed on a trekking forum and mentioned in a regional mountain community newspaper, but did not receive wider media coverage. Following the accident, the outfitter revised safety protocols to require roped travel across all glacier sections where crevasse presence was possible, even on approach routes traditionally considered low risk. It was July 15, 2013, at Grand Teton Base Camp during an unusually warm summer. East face routes showed instability from rapid morning warming and freeze-thaw cycles, prompting guides to warn of increased rockfall and postpone climbs until conditions stabilized. Cambria Fullerton, 35, was a corporate attorney from Jackson, Wyoming, whose career was built on persistence and asserting control in high-pressure situations. She approached mountaineering with the same mindset, viewing technical routes as challenges to negotiate rather than hazards to respect. Her climbing experience included non-technical peaks that required endurance, but she had no prior exposure to multi-pitch climbs or routes demanding rope systems and anchor placement. Fullerton's goal was to complete Exum Ridge in a single day to meet personal deadlines, framing guides as service providers whose recommendations could be challenged rather than safety authorities. By mid-morning, Fullerton had begun ascending the lower sections of Exum Ridge. The sun had warmed the east face, casting sharp shadows across jagged rock formations. Loose stones shifted under each footfall, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of heated rock and alpine vegetation. She moved deliberately along the exposed pitches, testing handholds and placing climbing protection, while remaining fully aware of the warnings about unstable terrain. The route demanded constant attention, but Fullerton's focus was split between rapid progression and documenting her climb for personal records. Despite multiple briefings warning of unstable rockfall zones and posted trail closures, Fullerton insisted on continuing. She repeatedly pressured her guide to maintain schedule objectives, dismissed route modifications, and advanced ahead of recommended safety pacing. During early morning exposure at the lower saddle, she ignored falling debris while documenting conditions, asserting that signed waivers and her own judgment justified her choices. Her guides cautioned that thermal expansion and loose rock made certain sections highly unstable, but Fullerton prioritized speed and completion over precaution. As Fullerton climbed higher along the Exum Ridge, the warming sun had already begun loosening small stones along the ridge's upper sections. The exposed metamorphic rock, fractured and jagged from previous freeze-thaw cycles, created a precarious environment where even minor thermal expansion could trigger large-scale rockfall. Fullerton moved quickly, placing protection as she ascended, but a dislodged boulder, roughly 25 pounds, plummeted from an overhanging ledge above her position. It struck her helmet directly, crushing the protective shell and transmitting extreme force through her skull. The impact caused immediate severe traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fractures, disrupting all voluntary nervous system function. The force of the strike broke Fullerton's grip on handholds, causing her to swing slightly before the climbing rope arrested her descent. She dangled precariously from her anchors, unable to support her own weight or regain control. Her body remained rigid from the combination of shock and injury, and loose debris continued to fall from above, striking the rope and surrounding rock surfaces. The sudden movement and vibration added further instability to the immediate area, forcing her guide to maintain tension on the belay line while assessing the situation from above, fully aware that any sudden motion could worsen the injury. Blood from cranial trauma began to soak through her clothing, and her breathing became irregular and shallow, indicating severe neurological compromise. Despite the guide's attempts to provide reassurance and prepare for technical rescue, Fullerton remained unresponsive, with agonal gasps marking the initial stages of brainstem failure. Hypothermia began to develop as she hung suspended in the thin alpine air, the combination of cold wind and metabolic shock compounding the effects of her injuries. Her guide immediately radioed rescue operations, but the narrow, steep terrain prevented immediate medical intervention. Technical ground teams required specialized rope and anchor systems to reach her position safely. By the time rescuers arrived several hours later, Fullerton was confirmed deceased from blunt force trauma sustained during the rockfall. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury with cervical spine fractures, noting that the incident resulted from natural objective hazards rather than equipment failure or guide negligence. Grand Teton National Park issued a formal report on the fatality, and guide services subsequently reinforced hazard acknowledgement protocols and emphasized that client timelines must yield to environmental safety, especially in thermal rockfall conditions. It was May 14, 2016. The GoPro powers on in darkness. The camera captures the interior of a high-altitude tent. The close nylon walls slick with condensation, a headlamp burning low, a compact stove running. The footage is steady. A pair of gloved hands moves through the frame, checking and rechecking an oxygen regulator with the kind of deliberate economy that does not belong to nervousness. It belongs to practice. The flow rate reads 2 liters per minute. 4 bottles are stacked near the door. The climber in the tent is Dara Solvik, 34, a structural engineer from Bozeman, Montana. She holds Norwegian-American citizenship, has no corporate sponsorship, and is not known to the general public. In small mountaineering circles, she has a specific reputation, 6 8,000-meter peaks summited, with a documented emphasis on technical solo routes in Patagonia and the Karakoram. She carries a laminated route card on every climb. Her emergency contact is her older sister, Renata, a pediatric nurse in Portland. The radio crackles from base camp. Kazi Dorje, 52, a retired Sherpa guide who manages Dara's supply logistics, weather relay, and communications from the 17,600-foot base camp elevation, confirms the weather window. 6 hours of stable conditions. A system is moving in from the west. Dara acknowledges, powers off the radio, and unzips the tent. Now listen, I'm no expert, but 6 hours sounds generous at sea level. How quickly does time disappear at nearly 5 miles above it? Kazi Dorje is not a high-altitude porter. He does not climb above Camp 1 at roughly 20,000 feet. His role is logistical and communicative, managing the expedition's supply chain, relaying contracted meteorological forecasts, and maintaining scheduled radio contact. At any moment during the ascent, he is the only person who knows Dara's precise position. From her apartment in Portland, Renata Dara monitors the base camp radio traffic through satellite relay. She can hear the transmissions between KZ and Dara, but she cannot intervene. She is a witness. Her planned route cuts diagonally across the southwest face, between the South Col Route and the unclimbed southwest pillar, through a couloir system she identified via satellite imagery, 2 glaciological surveys, and French aerial photographs. No previous attempt was on record. Based on what I've read, in late 2015, she presented the plan to 2 experienced Everest climbers at a mountaineering symposium in Denver. Both described the couloir system as a serac trap, terrain dominated by unstable hanging ice, and warned that the upper section could not be reliably read from below. She documented their objections in her planning journal, and she just continued. The audio on the early footage captures 2 additional pieces of context as Dara begins her traverse. The first is a reminder from Kazi, delivered on radio before she unzips the tent, that her chosen route places her outside any assisted rescue corridor. No fixed lines, no Sherpa presence, no coordination with any team operating on the mountain that day. She acknowledges. The second is a reference to a satellite phone call she received 2 nights earlier from Renata in Portland. The call is logged. Renata told her that approximately 200 bodies remain on Everest's slopes and asked her directly whether she was prepared to become the 201st. The call record shows the conversation lasted 11 minutes, and if the risk was stated that clearly, why didn't it change her decision? The GoPro captures the character of the lower terrain in reliable detail. A steep snowfield, hard-packed over ice, pitched at approximately 45 degrees. Dara moves across it in crampons, front-pointing with precision, her ice axe working in a steady rhythm. The technique is not discussed or narrated. It is simply visible, and it is clean. The couloir entrance appears on camera as a narrow channel cut between 2 rock buttresses. At the base of the channel, the floor is choked with debris from a serac collapse. Blocks of ice and snow deposited at irregular angles, the residue of a hanging glacier that failed at some previous point and came down through the exact passage she now needs to cross. She stops. She photographs the debris field with a handheld camera clipped to her harness. Her voice memo, recorded and transmitted via satellite relay to Kazi at base camp, describes the deposit as old, possibly 2 seasons, and characterizes the channel above as visually clean. The assessment comes in the language she uses habitually when evaluating structural conditions. The voice memos throughout the lower portion of the climb reference load-bearing angles, fracture line geometry, and ice stratification layers. These are the analytical frameworks of a structural engineer reviewing a building site, translated into the context of a mountain wall. The terminology is precise and the observations are systematic. Her professional background in evaluating the stability of physical structures is evident in every note. She crosses the debris field in 11 minutes without incident and clears the couloir entrance. The route above her opens into the channel. She radios KZ at 6:40 in the morning. He reads her an updated weather report. The window remains at 6 hours. She reports good progress and continues climbing. At this point, everything still appears to be working. But how long can luck last in a place like this? The voice memos logged throughout the lower climb, ice stratification, debris age, surface angles, weather, constitute the only technical record ever made from inside the couloir at this altitude. And when I looked further into the story, I found that glaciologists who later reviewed them noted that the observational quality was high, and that several conditions she described in neutral terms, refreezing melt layers, inconsistent ice stratification, hollowed serac bases, were, in retrospect, indicators of instability she registered but did not weight accordingly. The footage changes character at 27,200 feet. The change is not dramatic. Nothing falls, nothing shifts. The change is in what the camera now shows on the walls of the couloir as it narrows. Seracs, glacier ice blocks the size of buildings, collapse without warning. No sound, no visible precursor. Standard protocol on the South Col route is to clear serac zones before sunrise hits the face. The footage from Dara's camera at this section of the climb shows seracs on both walls of the narrowing couloir. Some are visibly fractured. The camera captures split surfaces, open fracture lines, and compression ice that holds its position not through structural integrity, but through temperature. The sun is already on the wall. The GoPro records the light changing as she climbs. She stops twice to look upward, scanning the walls. She does not speak during either pause. Then she begins moving faster. The footage from this section is visibly more urgent. Shorter steps, heavier impact, the camera shaking with her pace. Her breathing is audible, and it is no longer controlled in the way it was at lower elevations. At 27,500 feet, burning 2 liters of oxygen per minute, the math of supply versus demand is tightening. She does not stop to adjust the flow rate, and when oxygen, time, and structural stability all start running out at the same moment, which one fails first? She clears the serac band at 10:20 in the morning. The footage shows her stopping on a small ice shelf on the far side. She bends forward, hands on knees. 6 seconds pass. Then she straightens and looks up. It's the minute details like these that makes me feel sorry for Dara. Like the magnitude of the goal she's trying to reach is slowly chipping away at her confidence during the climb. The elapsed time from Camp 2 to the top of the serac band is approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. Her original plan projected 3 hours and 40 minutes for the same section. The difference of roughly 40 minutes is not catastrophic in isolation. At this altitude, with a fixed oxygen supply calculated against a fixed timeline, 40 minutes is a number that compounds forward through every subsequent decision. What the camera captures above her is the upper couloir. The satellite imagery and glaciological surveys she studied did not resolve the angle of this section accurately. The ice wall ahead is near vertical, closer to 80 degrees than the 60 to 65 degree pitch her planning assumed. It is not what she built the route around. She does not radio this observation to Kazi. When I looked it up, an 80-degree ice wall at 27,800 feet is not a hike. It is technical alpine climbing under conditions that remove most of the margin that technical alpine climbing depends on. There are no fixed ropes on this section of the face. There is no second climber to provide a belay from above or below. Dara is alone on terrain that offers no redundancy. A single crampon point pulling loose from the ice surface, a single axe placement that fails to hold, and the next contact with anything solid is 1,400 feet below. If one mistake here ends the climb instantly, why does she decide the summit is still worth the risk? She climbs in silence. The GoPro footage from this section is remarkable, not for anything that goes wrong, but for what it shows about what right looks like at this altitude under these conditions. Deliberate placements, 3 points of contact at all times, no wasted motion, no hesitation between moves. She places 2 ice screws at intervals and runs a short section of rope through them as self-belay anchors, protection that would arrest a short fall but not a long one. The footage captures her hands during the screw placements. They are shaking. The shake is not severe, but it is present in every frame. At 28,100 feet, Dara reaches a narrow ledge, approximately 14 inches of horizontal surface, and stops. She contacts Casey by radio. Her oxygen consumption has exceeded her projections. 2 of her 4 bottles are reading roughly 60% remaining. She tells Kazi she is reducing her flow rate from 2 liters per minute to 1.5. He does not argue. Personally, this part really frustrates me. He asks if she is considering turnaround. She tells him she is close to the traverse, the section of the route she has studied longest, the piece the entire line depends on. He reads her the updated weather report. The western system has accelerated. The window is now 4 hours, not 6. He really should have insisted that she cancel the climb. But without further contest, she just acknowledges and resumes climbing. The camera, as she moves away from the ledge, captures the ledge from above. It is smaller than it appeared from the footage recorded while she was standing on it. She reaches the top of the ice wall and moves on to the traverse. The plan, developed over months from satellite imagery, aerial photographs, and glaciological survey data, called for a 600-foot horizontal crossing on a snow bench. The bench, according to her research, would connect to the South Summit Ridge at the top and provide a stable platform for the crossing. She has spent more time studying this section than any other part of the route. The GoPro records what she finds instead. The snow bench exists. The geometry matches the imagery, but the bench is not structurally attached to the face beneath it. It is a cornice, a wind-loaded accumulation of snow that is built outward from the edge of the ridge over time. projecting over open air with nothing beneath it. Cornices are a common feature of high-altitude ridge terrain. They are also among the more reliable ways to die in the mountains because they extend beyond the solid edge of the face and can collapse without warning when weight is applied. Walking across a cornice is, structurally, walking across a ceiling that has no floor. I don't know if it's just me, but if the only path forward is literally hanging over empty air, I would have been done. She stops at the edge of the cornice. The camera faces down for a moment, then back along the intended line of traverse. She taps the surface twice with her ice axe, testing it. The sound the axe makes on the snow is audible in the recording. It is hollow. The traverse and the cornice discovery represent the pivot point of the climb. Everything before it is a record of a technically capable climber executing a difficult, unverified route with a high degree of competence and a managed set of compounding risks. Everything after it is a record of what happens when the planned descent route no longer exists and the planned ascent route is structurally impassable. The cornice does not represent a failure of execution. She did not fall. She made no mistake on the wall. The cornice represents the outer boundary of what satellite imagery and ground-level survey data from the 1980s and early 2000s could have reliably shown. The bench was there. The imagery was accurate. The imagery did not show what was beneath the surface, and nothing in her pre-expedition research could have established that without standing precisely where she was standing. She does not cross. Instead, she angles upward from the cornice edge, looking for a way to gain the South Summit Ridge from below, a line that bypasses the cornice entirely by climbing the mixed rock and ice terrain above it. She locates a viable section and begins climbing. It is 70-degree mixed ground. It adds 300 feet of unplanned vertical. Her oxygen supply is now at 40% on the second bottle. She has not opened bottles 3 or 4. At 28,600 feet, she pulls onto a small rock band and stops. The GoPro captures what is visible from this position, the South Summit, approximately 100 vertical feet above. She is close to the summit by any measure. The distance remaining is less than the distance she has already covered today. Then she looks down, and the moment she does, she realizes something far more serious than the climb itself. There's so much hints and details that frames this expedition as such a bad idea, and I think it's sad that she seems to realize the severity of the situation when she's already this deep. The couloir she ascended is no longer identifiable as a descent route. In the hours since she passed through, solar heating and shifting temperatures have altered the snow surface across the upper section of the ice wall. The face below the rock band is sheeted in refrozen melt, glassy, near vertical, and without any of the texture that allowed upward progress. Her ice screw anchors are 200 feet below. On the underside of the wall, she can no longer safely down climb. Below the ice wall, the serac band she passed through in the morning has changed. One of the seracs she moved beneath has shifted since she crossed under it. A horizontal crack, 2 feet wide, now runs the full width of the channel. The crack was not visible this morning. The route does not go down. She remains on the rock band without moving for 4 minutes. The GoPro faces downward for the entire duration. Then she keys the radio. Kazi Dorje receives the call at base camp at 1:14 in the afternoon. The transmission is clear. Both voices are steady throughout the exchange. The steadiness of both voices is what makes the recording difficult to listen to. Dara describes the cornice. She describes the ice conditions on the wall below. She describes the serac crack. She does so in the same systematic, technical language she used in the lower couloir voice memos. Organized observations, accurate measurements where she can provide them. Clear distinctions between what she has confirmed and what she is estimating. Kazi asks whether she can downclimb the mixed rock and ice section she used to reach the rock band. She tells him it is possible, but that the section leads back to the top of the ice wall, which she cannot descend safely without a top anchor that does not exist at her position. He asks about her oxygen. She tells him. He asks about the weather. She tells him the cloud system from the west is visible and moving toward her at a rate she estimates will put it at her position in approximately 90 minutes. If the weather arrives before she finds a way down, what happens to a climber trapped at 28,000 feet? What she says next made me really feel sorry for her. She tells Kazi that she believes she has climbed into a position she cannot get out of. Kazi does not respond for 3 seconds. In a statement later provided to the Nepalese Ministry of Tourism, Kazi described his understanding of the situation at this moment. He had been on Everest 7 times across his career as a guide. He recognized the language and the cadence of a climber who has completed a final assessment of their position, The language in that situation, he said, is always calm and always precise. She gives Casey her sister's phone number from memory and asks him to make contact. The number is already in the relay system. The exchange, from first contact to the end of the recorded portion, runs approximately 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, Dara provides a complete and accurate account of her tactical position, her remaining supplies, the route conditions above and below, and her assessment of the available options. She does not express doubt about the accuracy of her observations. She does not revise her estimates under questioning. She does not ask Kazi what he thinks she should do. She does not sit down. The footage from the rock band shows her moving continuously, not climbing, but searching. She works her way methodically along the ledge system, testing each section, probing surfaces with her axe, looking at angles. She identifies a narrow ice gully to the southeast that runs at a direction that could, if the ice is solid, allow a descending traverse onto terrain outside her current position. She swings the axe into the surface of the gully to test it. The pick drives through the outer crust and drops into hollow space beneath. She pulls it back. She opens bottle 3. If she is already conserving oxygen, what does opening another bottle say about how long she expects to remain here? The sky in the GoPro footage is changing. The flat, featureless blue of the morning has been replaced by a texture building from the west. Thin cloud layers stacking and thickening at the horizon, the leading edge visible at roughly her altitude. At 1:47 in the afternoon, Casey patches Renata Solvik through on the satellite relay from Portland. The connection quality is poor. The conversation is brief. Dara tells her sister that she has encountered problems on the route. Renata asks what kind of problems. Dara provides a short explanation. There is a pause in the recording. Renata asks what Dara is going to do. Dara tells her to wait. Renata Dara provided a statement to the Norwegian Alpine Club's accident investigators the following year. She described staying on the open line for approximately 40 minutes after the exchange, before the signal degraded and the connection dropped. During that time, she reported hearing wind through the audio. The last point at which she heard her sister's voice, she said, was approximately 2:20 in the afternoon. At 2:08 in the afternoon, with the footage still recording, Dara makes a decision and begins implementing it. She starts down climbing the 70-degree mixed section she used to reach the rock band. She faces outward, using her axes in compression against ice patches between crumbling rock, descending without a top rope in conditions that do not permit it. Over the next 12 minutes, she descends approximately 40 feet. The footage from this sequence is difficult for me to watch. Not because of any fall, no fall occurs. The difficulty is in the quality of each placement, the margin visible in every move, the distance between what each placement is being asked to hold and what it can reliably hold. She reaches the top of the ice wall at 40 feet below the rock band. She looks at the angle. She cannot continue the descent safely without a belay from below that is not available. She climbs back up, 12 minutes up. Her breathing rate on the audio, recorded at 28,300 feet on 1.5 liters of oxygen per minute, is audible and elevated well beyond the pace of the lower mountain. Bottle 3 is being consumed faster than any bottle before it. The Western system reaches her position at approximately 2:50 in the afternoon. The GoPro footage documents the speed of the transition. Full visibility, the entire southwest face visible below, the south summit ridge clear above, to near zero in under 6 minutes. The change is not gradual. Wind arrives first, then snow horizontal in the frame, then the microphone clips out entirely from the noise level. The camera lens clouds with driven ice crystals. The temperature, already well below 0 Fahrenheit at this altitude before the storm, drops sharply with the wind chill added. The nearest other climbers on Everest at this moment are operating on the South Col route, approximately 1.2 miles away, horizontally and at a lower elevation. They are themselves descending in deteriorating conditions. No member of any team on the mountain that day is aware that a climber is on the southwest face at 28,600 feet. There is no rescue corridor. There is no coordination point. There is no position from which another climber could reach her location in time, on an unmarked route, in these conditions. The footage shows her finding the largest rock on the band, 3 feet of vertical profile, roughly, and pulling herself in behind it. She tightens her down suit collar. She adjusts her oxygen mask. The rock is not enough to block the wind. It is what is available. Radio contact with Kazi degrades at 3:10 in the afternoon. His last clearly recorded transmission tells her what she has already understood. No helicopter rescue is possible above 23,000 feet in these conditions. No climbing team is positioned to reach her location. He tells her to find the best shelter available and conserve oxygen. She acknowledges. The transmission cuts out and does not reconnect. The satellite relay logs no further two-way communication after 3:14 p.m. Renata Dara, monitoring from Portland, loses the feed entirely within the same window. If the final radio call has already happened, what remains for a climber alone at this altitude? The camera continues recording for approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes past the 3:10 radio contact before the footage ends. In that window, the footage provides the only remaining record of Dara's condition and position. The following sequence is, in my opinion, the most harrowing part of this story. At 3:30 in the afternoon, she is behind the rock. She is conscious. Small movements are visible. Adjustments to her body position, incremental shifts as she works to stay out of the direct wind. She is on oxygen. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the camera captures her opening bottle 4. It is her last. She turns the flow regulator down to 1 liter per minute, maximum conservation. At 4:40 in the afternoon, she shifts her position. The wind is still heavy in the audio. Visibility in the frame is less than 15 feet. She moves her legs, then her torso, repositioning against the rock. At 5:02 in the afternoon, she stands. The reason is not determinable from the footage. She moves forward, away from the rock and toward the edge of the rock band. She passes the edge of the camera's frame and does not reappear. The GoPro, left on the rock surface or dropped, continues recording. The frame shows wind and ice in varying density. The light fades at the rate of a high-altitude evening in mid-May. The battery dies at 5:24 in the afternoon. The footage ends. In Dara's last moments, I keep thinking what was going through her mind. Kazi Dorje filed a missing persons report with the Nepalese Ministry of Tourism on the evening of May 14, 2016. A search assessment conducted on May 16th deployed 2 contracted Sherpa climbers to the couloir entrance at approximately 27,000 feet. They did not proceed further. The lower serac had partially collapsed in the intervening period, and the entry to the couloir system was no longer passable. A second limited search effort in late May, conducted during a brief stable weather window, put a 2-person contracted team onto the southwest face via an approach line above the collapsed serac. They did not locate Solvik's body. On the rock band at 28,600 feet, they recovered the GoPro camera, still clipped to the rock where the final footage shows it coming to rest. That footage was reviewed by a Kathmandu-based mountaineering accident board and 2 glaciologists at Renata's request. No further recovery operation was attempted. Renata held a memorial service for her sister in Portland that October, and I can only imagine how hard it is to mourn someone without a casket. It was February 9th, 2026, in a gully approach route leading toward a high-altitude mountain camp on an 8,000-meter peak. Overnight wind had deposited smooth, hollow-sounding snowdrifts inside the channel, creating classic wind slab, avalanche conditions along the slope. Navid Lorne was 33 years old, a radiology technologist from a mountain city in western Canada. His professional work with medical imaging had trained him to recognize subtle pattern abnormalities and structural irregularity. He trained during winter seasons on mountain ranges in his region and developed conservative instincts regarding avalanche terrain. This was his first expedition to a major 8,000-meter mountain. Navid and his climbing partner were tasked with establishing a supply cache at a high intermediate camp before returning the same day. Despite visible wind loading in the central gully, he continued forward, traveling alone without probing the snow surface for stability. The route followed a moderately steep snow gully between rock ridges leading toward the high camp platform. Recent snowfall and strong winds had formed wind-drifted snow slabs resting over weaker layers below. The temperature remained well below freezing, with blowing snow visible along higher ridges. The primary danger was a poorly bonded wind slab that could release under a small trigger. Base staging communication had already issued warnings regarding wind loading risk. Another team delayed their carry mission after hearing settlement noises and observing small cracking sounds during snow pole tests. Risk increased when Navid moved slightly left to bypass a small rock outcrop. This shift placed him onto a smoother, thicker slab, showing classic wind deposition characteristics. Rather than retreating downslope to safer terrain, he moved quickly across the section, taking several rapid steps in the belief that reducing time on the slope would reduce exposure. His partner waited in a sheltered position roughly a short distance below, maintaining visual contact as the slope surface became quieter and more compacted under Navid's weight. The avalanche released near the middle of the gully below the high camp platform. At approximately mid-morning, a weak layer beneath a wind slab, roughly 1 foot thick, collapsed at a convex rollover zone. A sharp cracking sound was followed by a low whoomph sensation as the slab fractured. The crown opened across a wide horizontal line, and the snow mass began accelerating downslope immediately. Navid was knocked off balance and carried with the moving debris. Witnesses reported he attempted swimming motions toward the surface while blocks of consolidated snow moved over him. His arm was visible twice during the descent, as he fought to remain above the moving debris field. The avalanche traveled down a narrowing chute, gaining speed across a long vertical drop, before depositing into a debris zone far below the release point. He was carried a long distance downslope and buried beneath dense avalanche debris. The burial depth was significant enough to compress the chest region and fill the airway with snow. External bleeding was not observed during recovery. The slide duration was brief, followed by silence except for blowing wind, as hypoxia under compact debris likely caused loss of consciousness within minutes. The partner immediately initiated an avalanche beacon search and probe line while radioing the main staging camp. Communication was maintained through relay radio channels and later satellite contact. Search assistance arrived after some time from personnel stationed lower on the route. Response speed was limited by secondary release risk and difficult movement through unstable debris. Navid was located using an avalanche transceiver within a short search interval. Extrication required additional minutes, but he showed no pulse or spontaneous breathing when reached. Medical assessment identified asphyxia due to avalanche burial as the primary cause of death, with contributing factors including wind slab relief, chest compression from debris loading, and rapid oxygen deprivation. Recovered evidence included crown fracture photographs, snow layer analysis showing a hard slab resting over weak faceted snow, and a helmet surface showing minor abrasion consistent with debris tumbling. The incident was mentioned briefly in expedition bulletins and regional mountain community notices. Following the accident, climbing groups shifted route preference to a ridge-based line, avoiding the gully corridor, and delayed supply carries until wind slab layers had more time to stabilize. It was June 23, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where unusually warm pre-monsoon temperatures hung in the air. The tent city buzzed with climbers preparing gear and rotations, while thin air carried the sense of stoves, glacier ice, and yak meat, and prayer flags snapped against the Khumbu Glacier. Kendall Wexford, a 28-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager from Seattle. She had built her career on aggressive efficiency, refusing to accept delays or limitations, and approached mountaineering with the same mindset. Wexford's experience included moderate peaks in Nepal and the Pacific Northwest, but none involved technical glacier travel, rope team coordination, or high-altitude hazards above 20,000 feet. She had hired a mid-tier Nepali guiding company and considered their role primarily as logistical support rather than technical instructors, viewing safety protocols as optional barriers to completing her summit push on schedule. Wexford repeatedly dismissed concerns about warm temperatures and unstable snow bridges, arguing that speed and efficiency were more important than caution. Over the following days, she ignored standard rope team procedures, skipped team briefings, criticized base camp logistics, and insisted on advancing ahead to demonstrate her preferred pace, leaving guides frustrated and increasingly concerned for her safety. The first glacier rotation to Camp 1 exposed the risks of her approach. Crossing crevasse fields at high altitude, Wexford hesitated and rushed intermittently, ignoring probe testing. Her guides attempted to enforce rope travel and spacing, but she unroped herself and advanced ahead. Warm conditions had softened snow bridges, making them unpredictable under weight. At Camp 1, she demanded minimal rest and insisted the team maintain her schedule, dismissing recommendations to pause until ice and snow conditions stabilized. On the second rotation toward Camp 2, Wexford continued to flout standard safety protocols. She pressured her guides to increase the pace, skipped proper spacing in the rope team, and refused to probe or test snow bridges at critical crevasse crossings. Even under repeated warnings, she insisted on advancing alone, ignoring flexing snow bridges and the unstable conditions caused by unusually warm temperatures at high altitude. While crossing a visibly weakened snow bridge spanning a wide crevasse, the structure collapsed beneath her, sending her plunging into the narrow chasm. During the fall, she struck sharp ice edges and a protruding rock shelf, fracturing both femurs and sustaining severe internal trauma. Her backpack and helmet shifted violently, causing additional blunt force injuries as she tumbled against the crevasse walls. The crevasse was too narrow for rescuers to see her directly, and the high walls reflected sound poorly, making communication nearly impossible. Her headlamp illuminated only a small area around her, revealing snow debris and ice shards, but no stable footing. Blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma caused her to lose consciousness within 20 minutes, leaving her completely dependent on technical rescue teams to reach her before prolonged exposure worsened her condition. The guides immediately initiated crevasse rescue procedures, but warm snow and unstable anchors significantly slowed operations. A satellite call to coordinate additional support confirmed that helicopter evacuation was impossible due to rotor hazards over the narrow opening. Ground-based technical rescue teams required 4 hours to reach the location with specialized equipment. Wexford's body was recovered at 12:30 p.m. The medical examiner determined death was due to massive internal bleeding from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, with contributing factors including bilateral femur fractures and early hypothermia from exposure. The incident reinforced the extreme hazards of high-altitude glacier travel in unstable conditions and underscored the necessity of strict adherence to guide authority and rope team protocols. Expedition companies subsequently revised safety agreements to prevent clients from overriding technical instructions during hazardous climbs. It was January 2nd, 2026, on K2's Abruzzi Spur at the Lower Black Pyramid, roughly 24,000 feet above sea level. The morning air was unusually still, a silence experience climbers knew could be deceptive. On K2, quiet conditions often preceded instability, especially along exposed mixed rock faces warmed by sunlight. Olin Mercer was 34 years old, a mechanical technician from Toledo, Ohio. He treated climbing as a structured personal challenge rather than a pursuit of recognition. Friends described him as careful with equipment, spending extra time verifying harness locks and anchor positions before moving. Mercer was patient but disliked unnecessary delays on fixed line. He had completed 2 high-altitude summits above 20,000 feet in South America, where terrain was technical but less vertically exposed than K2. This was his first attempt at an 8,000-meter peak, which he viewed as a test of precision and endurance. The expedition he joined operated on a limited budget, relying heavily on shared logistics and pre-installed rope systems along the Abruzzi Spur. Their objective was conservative: reach Camp 3, rest at altitude, and wait for a predicted weather window before higher movement. The Abruzzi Spur remains extremely dangerous. Rockfall funnels through narrow gullies surrounding the Black Pyramid, where mixed ice and brittle metamorphic rock provide little reliable protection. During summer, debris fall is common, and afternoons accelerate stone movement due to solar heating. By late morning, climbers encountered congestion near a bottleneck section. One climber above reported a jammed ascender, forcing others to wait while exposed beneath an overhanging rock band. Porters stationed at Camp 2 had warned teams to cross early. The dark rock surface absorbed sunlight as the day progressed, slowly destabilizing loose fragments inside shallow cracks. Instead of waiting, Mercer unclipped from the primary rope and began a lateral traverse using a secondary anchor system. For approximately 12 feet, he moved across a sloping ledge beneath a rock overhang. Wind speeds were estimated between 10 and 20 miles per hour, and visibility was clear, creating a deceptive sense of stability despite the hazard of falling debris. The failure sequence began. A fist-sized stone detached from 40 to 60 feet above and struck Mercer's helmet, staggering him but not immediately causing a fall. Witnesses saw him lose one crampon point while trying to stabilize. Almost immediately, a larger fragment weighing about 8 to 10 pounds struck his right shoulder. The force rotated his body downslope and placed abnormal lateral stress on his daisy chain connection. During movement, the carabiner gate contacted the rock surface and partially opened. When full body weight loaded the connector under sideways stress, the device failed. Mercer was pulled from the ledge and fell approximately 18 feet onto a lower rock rib. The impact briefly slowed the fall, but the remaining attachment separated. He then fell another 65 feet across mixed rock and snow, before coming to rest on a narrow bench. The total fall distance was about 83 feet over 5 to 7 seconds. A climber 40 feet above witnessed the sequence. Helmet camera footage later recovered at base camp recorded the sound of impacts but showed no clear visual record of falling debris. Medical assessment indicated a depressed skull fracture despite helmet protection, right-sided flail chest injury, and an open tibia-fibula fracture. Mercer showed brief agonal breathing, but did not regain consciousness. The witness radioed Camp 2 immediately, and base camp was notified through satellite communication. 2 high-altitude porters attempted technical ascent, but continuing minor rockfall delayed access. Reaching the location required about 3 hours. Helicopter evacuation was impossible. Mercer's body was lowered to Camp 2 the following morning, when rockfall activity decreased, then transported to base camp over 2 additional days. Post-incident review identified blunt force trauma as the primary cause of death, with contributing factors including extreme altitude, delayed rescue capability, and failure of a non-locking carabiner under lateral stress. Recovered evidence included a fractured helmet, a bent connector, and helmet camera audio files capturing the impacts. The accident received only brief public attention. Afterward, fixed lines were rerouted away from the unstable overhang, and climbing schedules were adjusted to cross the Black Pyramid earlier in the day. On K2, survival often depends not only on strength or skill, but on timing in a place where the mountain itself decides movement. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. Guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. It was January 8, 2017, and K2 Base Camp sat frozen on the Baltoro Glacier at roughly 16,400 feet, buried under a silence that had nothing to do with peace. The temperature hovered around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind came in gusts that snapped tent fabric like gunshots and drove ice crystals into every gap between layers. The glacier beneath camp groaned and shifted, deep sounds that rose through boot soles. In summer, this place would have held dozens of expeditions. In January, it was nearly empty. 3 small teams had set up in separate clusters, their tents the only color against gray rock, white ice, and the massive pyramid of K2 rising above it all. 28,251 feet of limestone, ice, and wind. The mountain dominated the skyline in a way photographs never captured. It was geometric and hostile, its flanks too steep to hold snow in most places, its ridgelines sharp enough to seem artificial. Winter K2 had never been summited. Every expedition that had tried, stretching back decades, had been beaten back by conditions that made the mountain's already savage reputation seem generous. Wind speeds above 25,000 feet routinely exceeded 80 miles per hour. Temperatures with wind chill dropped below -70. The jet stream sat directly on K2's upper pyramid through the winter months, stripping the mountain of anything trying to cling to it. Fingers stopped working, faces froze, minds slowed to a crawl. I need you to hold on to that for a second. Entire national expeditions, large teams, deep funding, decades of experience had thrown everything at this mountain in winter and come back empty. That's the objective we're talking about here. Among the 3 expeditions was a small Polish team organized by Otylia Kasperzak, a 34-year-old mountaineer from Krakow. Otylia had come to climbing through competitive cross-country skiing, racing on the Nordic circuit until a shoulder injury ended her career at 24. The transition happened quickly. She was fit, disciplined, and possessed the endurance base that made high-altitude suffering more tolerable than it was for most. Within 4 years, she had summited Manaslu with full guide support and then Broad Peak the following summer without a personal guide, organizing a small Polish team and reaching the summit via the standard route. That unguided summit gave her legitimate credibility among sponsors and permit authorities. She held solid winter alpine credentials as well, hard ice routes in the Tatra, multi-day winter climbs in the Bernese Oberland, and Mont Blanc Massif. In 2015, she joined a larger Polish team attempting Nanga Parbat in winter. That expedition pushed to Camp 3 at roughly 23,000 feet before a storm settled over the mountain and erased the remaining window. The attempt gave Otylia a winter 8,000-meter entry that carried real weight. 23,000 feet in winter conditions was serious, but it was still a long way from the 28,000-foot commitment that Winter K2 demanded. 1 guided summit, 1 unguided summit, and a winter attempt that reached 23,000 feet before the weather killed it. A real resume, more than most people will ever do. But for Winter K2, I kept looking at it and thinking she needed another 5 years before this made sense. Her identity had been built around Poland's tradition of winter Himalayan climbing. She grew up idolizing the Polish ice warriors who pioneered winter ascents when no one else thought it possible. She positioned herself as the next chapter, though the broader Polish mountaineering community viewed her with quiet skepticism. But she had an audience. Her social media following had grown large enough to attract sponsors, a gear company, Company, an energy drink brand, and a Polish outdoor magazine documenting the expedition. The original plan was a 2017 to 2018 attempt, a full year of preparation, larger team, more funding, and time to rehabilitate the torn meniscus she had suffered the previous spring. The injury required a partial meniscectomy that left the knee functional but permanently compromised. Her surgeon was direct. The remaining cartilage would wear faster under sustained impact. No hard deadline, but the trajectory was clear. She could feel it in the stiffness every morning and the ache after every descent. That knee becomes important later. I want you to hold on to it. Then Weronika Mazur announced her own Winter K2 expedition for 2017 to 2018. Weronika and Otylia had come up through the same Polish alpine clubs, summited together on earlier peaks. But the relationship had cooled into something neither would call rivalry out loud, but both understood in private. Weronika had stronger technical credentials, harder roots, more winter experience, a quiet reputation that no social media following could manufacture. If Weronika reached K2's summit in winter first, the narrative Otylia had spent years constructing would belong to someone else. Otylia moved everything up by a full year. Smaller team, less funding, incomplete rope-fixing plan for the upper mountain. Her base camp manager, a Polish logistics coordinator named Marek with years of Karakorum experience, expressed concern from the start about the compressed timeline. But Otylia held the permits and the funding, and the expedition moved on her schedule. So, just to make sure we're all tracking, she took an expedition that needed a full year of preparation, cut it in half, went in with a smaller team, less money, and a knee her surgeon had already flagged, all because another woman announced a climb for the season she originally planned. That decision right there is where everything that follows starts. Her climbing Sherpas were recruited from Nepal. Chewang Lendu was 36, a veteran of 12 8,000-meter summits who had spent 15 years in high-altitude guiding. He was quiet, meticulous, and supported his daughter's education in Kathmandu with the income these contracts provided. Winter bonus pay was substantial, which was the primary reason anyone agreed to work K2 in January. His partner was Sonam Chotar, 28, with 5 8,000-meter summits and a cautious disposition. Sonam had married the previous autumn and taken this contract because the pay would cover 2 years of expenses in a single season. Chewang's daughter and Sonam's new wife. Those are the people waiting at the other end of this contract. I kept thinking about that as the rest of this unfolded. Neither Sherpa appeared in Otylia's social media with any consistency. Her posts framed the expedition around her personal story, the knee, the comeback, the legacy, with minimal mention of the Pakistani HAPs and Nepali Sherpas doing the actual work. At base camp, she recorded a video diary that referred to Chewang as her Sherpa, language that reduced a man with more high-altitude experience than she would ever accumulate to a possessive pronoun and a job title. Her Sherpa. 12 8,000-meter summits, 15 years of keeping people alive at altitude, and she filed him under my. That framing tells me everything about how she saw the people around her on that mountain. The first rotation reached Camp 1 at roughly 20,000 feet. Otylia moved adequately on the ascent, but struggled with the cold in ways that surprised Chewang. Winter K, too cold, was categorically different from anything in Europe. It conducted heat away from exposed skin in seconds and punished every lapse in layering management. Her glove transitions were slow and reactive. She waited until her fingers were numb before switching to warmer mitts rather than managing warmth proactively. More concerning was her knee. On the descent, Chewang watched her down climb and saw a stiffness in her right leg that went beyond fatigue. She favored the joint on steep terrain, shifting weight to compensate for limited range of motion. He mentioned it to Sonam privately. Neither was sure the base camp manager had been told the full picture. During that rotation, Otylia insisted the filmmaker accompany them to Camp 1, adding weight to loads already stretched thin. Sonam ended up carrying a camera bag in addition to his own gear, slowing the rotation by nearly 2 hours. Chewang raised the issue through Marek. Otylia overruled it. When Chewang pushed a second time, the response carried an edge. She told him, through Marek, that logistics decisions were not his to make. 15 years on 8,000-meter peaks, and he's told to stay in his lane by someone whose winter high altitude ceiling was 23,000 feet on someone else's expedition. That's the dynamic on this expedition, and it never got better. The second rotation targeted Camp 2 at 21,500 feet. Winds hit 60 miles per hour on the approach. Their tent nearly ripped from its anchors before all guy lines were set. A gust caught the unsecured side before Sonam threw his weight onto the fabric. He spent 2 hours outside in the wind, reinforcing the shelter, while Ottilia waited inside. When conditions failed to improve, they retreated. That evening, Ottilia posted a photo from Camp 2, herself in goggles, ice crusting her mask, captioned about strategic patience. The caption described the retreat as her decision. No mention of Sonam's 2 hours in the wind. No mention that the call to descend originated with Chaewang. I've gone through enough of these stories to see the pattern, and it's always the same. The person who contributes the least controls the narrative, every single time. Back at base camp, she checked Werenika's social media. Werenika had posted training photos, winter climbing in the Tatras, heavy load carries. Ottilia studied the posts longer than she would have admitted. That detail is small, but it stuck with me. Sitting at base camp on the most dangerous mountain on Earth and scrolling through a rival's training photos. That's where her mind was. By late January, the expedition was approaching its practical limits. Food and fuel were finite. Marek indicated operations would need to wind down within 2 weeks. Then the forecast shifted. A narrow weather window appeared, 36 to 48 hours of reduced wind above 25,000 feet. Speeds predicted to drop from 80 plus to 30 or 40 miles per hour. The first real opportunity of the season. Chaewang and Sonam evaluated the window and concluded it was insufficient. Too short, the upper camps not fully stocked, and even the reduced winds far beyond safe margins. They recommended ending the expedition. Marek supported their assessment and told Ottilia directly via radio. Ottilia disagreed, not with anger, with a controlled, measured certainty that Chaewang later said unnerved him more than shouting would have. She acknowledged their assessment, thanked them, and systematically dismantled it. She framed their caution as conservatism she could not afford. She noted another expedition was also eyeing the window. She did not mention Werenika by name, but the urgency was audible. This was likely the only window, and if she went home without a serious attempt, her timeline collapsed. Her knee would be worse by then. The math only worked if she moved now. 3 people with direct knowledge of this mountain told her not to go. She thanked them and went anyway. I'm not sure what else anyone could have done at that point. She pushed a position at Camp 3 with Camp 4 as a possibility only if conditions held. Chaewang initially refused. He told Marek over radio that the window was insufficient and he would not take a client above Camp 2 in these conditions. Ottilia's response was calm and final. She would go with or without Sherpa support, and she began preparing her pack. Chaewang agreed to climb to Camp 3 on 2 conditions. They would not push higher unless the updated forecast showed improvement, and if he called for descent, there would be no discussion. Ottilia accepted the terms. Marek formally outlined the remaining risks over radio and documented her acknowledgement. Then the team prepared to move. They departed Camp 2 on a morning where the ambient temperature sat around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Abruzzi above Camp 2 demanded sustained technical climbing, steep mixed terrain where every step required deliberate crampon placement. The cold entered through seams, through zippers, through every gap in layering systems designed to prevent exactly this. Ottilia's knee announced itself within the first hour. The cold had stiffened the joint overnight, and she could no longer disguise the limited range of motion. She favored her right leg on steep sections, planting her left foot higher and pulling through rather than pushing evenly. The imbalance slowed her significantly between 22,000 and 23,500 feet. Chaewang and Sonam adjusted pace to match, watching time bleed away they could not afford. They reached Camp 3 at roughly 24,000 feet exhausted. The tent was barely functional. Wind damage had torn a fly seam, the vestibule zipper, partially frozen open. Sonam reinforced it, while Ottilia rested inside and Chaewang melted snow. That evening, Marek relayed updated weather data. The window was closing ahead of schedule, wind speeds at 26,000 feet ticking upward, the high-pressure system weakening faster than models predicted. Chaewang reviewed the data and urged immediate descent at first light. Ottilia refused. She told Chaewang they would push toward Camp 4 in the morning and evaluate as they climbed, and added that the filmmaker at Camp 2 still had no footage above 24,000 feet, meaning the expedition had produced nothing her sponsors could use. Chaewang's response was the most direct of the entire expedition. At those altitudes in winter, Evaluating as you climb meant committing to conditions you could not safely retreat from. Ascending gave options. Descending in a storm above 25,000 feet gave nothing. Ottilia listened, thanked him, and repeated her plan. It was just the three of them above 24,000 feet. The part that's hard for me to move past is how she thanked him. Not dismissive, not rude, polite enough to close the conversation without hearing a single word. I'd almost rather she had argued. At least that would have meant the warning landed somewhere. They departed Camp 3 in pre-dawn darkness. Ottilia's knee was worse. The joint had stiffened further overnight, and her first steps carried a hitch both Sherpas cataloged silently. The route above Camp 3 climbed through rock bands and ice fields, terrain alternating between technical mixed climbing and exposed traverses. Their small team had only fixed ropes on critical sections, leaving gaps where all three moved roped together at 50-foot intervals. By 24,500 feet, the signs were there for anyone trained to read them. Spindrift had picked up, thin streams of snow blowing off ridgelines above in patterns that indicated wind acceleration at higher altitude. The plume off K2's summit pyramid, modest at dawn, was thickening and bending sharply east. Chiwang watched it between steps. He had seen plumes like that before, and they never meant the window was holding. He communicated his concern to Sonam with a look that required no translation. Neither said anything to Ottilia. They were already committed to the conditions Chiwang had warned about the night before. At approximately 25,200 feet, the window collapsed. Wind speeds surged past 70 miles per hour within minutes, scouring the face with ice particles that stung through every layer. Visibility dropped to near zero. Wind chill plunged below -70. The mountain had decided. When I tell you the window collapsed, I don't mean it got worse gradually. It went from holdable to unsurvivable in minutes. And they were 1,000 feet above the nearest shelter, with nowhere to go but back down through it. Chiwang called for immediate retreat. For the first time on the expedition, there was no argument. They turned and began descending terrain now coated in verglas. Thin, transparent ice formed when wind-driven moisture froze on contact with rock. Every foothold became uncertain. During the descent, Ottilia's goggles iced over. She stopped and removed them to clear the buildup, exposing her face to the full wind for several seconds. Frostbite began immediately on her nose and cheeks. Rather than continuing with impaired but functional vision, she stopped completely and demanded Chiwang fix the goggles. Sonam anchored above, while Chiwang stripped his outer mitts, working in liner gloves that offered almost no thermal protection at -70 wind chill. He cleared the lens, adjusted the seal, fitted them back on her face. Less than 2 minutes. But 2 minutes of liner glove exposure at those temperatures carried consequences. Ottilia said nothing about the trade he had just made. They resumed descending. That moment right there is the one I kept coming back to. Chiwang strips his mitts in -70 wind chill to fix a problem she created and gets nothing. Not a word. And those 2 minutes in liner gloves follow him off the mountain. Remember that when we get to the end. Below 24,500 feet, they reached an unfixed section, steep verglas-coated rock, where all three moved on the same rope. Chiwang led the descent. Ottilia moved in the middle. Sonam anchored from above. The step was unremarkable. Ottilia planted her right foot on angled rock, weighted it, and felt the knee buckle. Not dramatically, but with the slow structural failure of a joint performing beyond its capacity. The cartilage-depleted surface couldn't stabilize under lateral load. Her crampon scraped verglas without catching. She fell, the knee, the one her surgeon warned her about, the one that had been deteriorating visibly for days while she ignored it. I'd been waiting for this moment since base camp, and honestly, so had Chiwang and Sonam. They just couldn't say it. She tumbled downward past Chiwang's position. The rope snapped taut and ripped him off his stance. On verglas, there was nothing to brace against. He was dragged across rock and ice until he impacted an outcrop with his right side. The force destroyed his knee, torn ligaments, tibial plateau fracture. The system loaded onto Sonam's anchor above. The sudden rope jerk ripped his outer mitt partially off his right hand, the rope catching the cuff and peeling it back. The mitt stayed on its wrist leash but no longer covered his fingers. His anchor held. Ottilia had pendulumed roughly 40 feet before the rope arrested her against a rock band. The impact cracked her helmet, broke ribs on her left side, and fractured her left forearm. She hung semi-conscious on the harness, body already beginning the irreversible heat loss that altitude and immobility guaranteed. Sonam secured his anchor, pulled the damaged mitt over his hand as best he could, and descended to Chaewang. Chiwang's right knee was finished, swelling fast, unable to bear weight, but he was conscious and functional above the waist. Together, they reached Otilia and hauled her back onto the traverse. She was hypothermic. Frostbite had advanced across her nose, cheeks, and fingers. Her eyes opened when spoken to, but focused slowly. They could not carry her. Two men, one with a destroyed knee, on a steep traverse and 70-mile-per-hour wind. The only option was to get her moving with support on both sides. What followed was measured in feet, not miles. Otilia managed short sections, 10 steps, 15, before stopping. Each stop bled warmth that could not be replaced. Her responses to prompting became slower, then absent, then mechanical. Chiwang hobbled beside her on a knee that sent white signals of pain through his body with every step, refusing to let go of her arm. Sonam worked the rope and broke trail through conditions that would have challenged him fresh. Camp 3 was below them. The tent was below them. Warmth and shelter were close enough that the cruelty of the distance was worse than the distance itself. At approximately 24,200 feet, roughly 200 vertical feet above Camp 3, Otilia sat down on the snow and did not stand up again. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes were open but flat, emptied of everything behind them. No fear, no recognition, no fight. Sonam tried to lift her. She did not resist. She did not respond. Her body had made the decision her mind could no longer make. They stayed longer than they should have. Chiwang's knee had swollen so severely, his pant leg was taut against the joint. Sonam's right hand had 3 fingertips that were waxy white and completely numb. Every minute they remained was a minute closer to the mountain taking all 3. The calculation was not complicated. It was just unbearable. 200 feet. That's the number I can't stop turning over. The tent was 200 vertical feet below where she stopped. On a clear day, you could see the fabric from where she sat down. I don't think mountaineering has a crueler distance than that. They left her where she sat. Sonam had to pull Chiwang's arm to get him moving. Not because Chiwang believed she could be saved, but because leaving someone behind required a kind of permission the mountain never gave. They descended to Camp 3, crawled inside the tent, and spent the night in conditions that would have been desperate even without injuries. Wind hammering the shelter, cold seeping through the floor, Chiwang's knee immobilized, and Sonam's hand wrapped in every piece of dry fabric they could find. Neither spoke about what they had left 200 feet above them. In the morning, they descended to Camp 2, a descent that should have taken hours but stretched across most of the day. Chiwang dragged his right leg through terrain that punished weakness, using his ice axe as a crutch on sections where the angle demanded 2 working knees. Sonam broke trail and anchored every steep section alone. In Islamabad, Chaewang's knee was confirmed as a torn ACL, with a tibial plateau fracture requiring surgical reconstruction. The damage left him with permanent limited range of motion. He never worked above 20,000 feet again. The career that defined his life reduced to base camp logistics, coordinating loads he would never carry himself. The liner glove exposure during the goggle repair cost him sensation in 3 fingertips. Nerve damage saved from amputation, but never fully recovered. Sonam lost the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand, the hand exposed when the rope tore his mitt during the fall. His grip strength diminished permanently, and he stepped back from high-altitude guiding within 2 seasons. He was 30 years old. Otilia Kasperzak's body was never recovered from K2. She was 34 years old. The footage captured at lower camps was never released. Her social media accounts remained active for weeks, still accumulating comments from followers who did not yet know what had happened, encouraging messages beneath posts that now read like artifacts from a timeline that had already ended. Veronica Molzer's 2017 to 2018 expedition was later canceled due to funding issues. No woman summited K2 in winter that year, or the next. Here's where I land after going through all of this. She rushed the expedition by a year to beat a rival whose attempt never even happened. She brought a knee her surgeon told her was failing. She overruled every person who told her to stop. And when the bill came due, she's not the one who paid most of it. Chiwang coordinates base camp loads now with 3 numb fingertips and a knee that won't bend past 90 degrees. Sonam can't grip an ice axe properly. They went home to the families they were trying to provide for with bodies that will never work the same, because someone decided her timeline mattered more than the people standing next to her. It was February 7, 2026, at a high-altitude camp platform along a remote 8,000-meter mountain route. Gusts had been building for several hours, pulling at tent fabric and creating a low humming sound through guy lines anchored into frozen snow. Tycho Raymer was 41, an HVAC installer from a cold northern city in the United States. His work with heating and cooling systems gave him familiarity with airflow and pressure movement, and he often compared mountain wind behavior to industrial ventilation. He had prior experience climbing ice during winter seasons and had successfully reached the summit of one major high-altitude mountain in North America. Teammates described him as strong during load carries, but sometimes impatient when fatigue accumulates. Tycho was part of a guided expedition preparing for a summit attempt during a predicted weather window. His objective was to rest at the high camp platform overnight and move upward with the team the following day. The camp consisted of narrow snow terraces cut into a steep slope, with long exposure to open air on the outer edge. Wind speeds were increasing through the evening, with gusts strong enough to shake anchored equipment. Ambient temperature remained well below freezing, accompanied by blowing spindrift that reduced visibility. Guides had advised doubling guy lines and clipping into fixed camp anchors while resting inside tents. Several nearby climbers reinforced their shelters after observing a tent corner lift briefly during an earlier gust. Tycho placed his two-person tent near the platform edge, using only 2 snow pickets instead of the recommended 4. He also chose not to clip his personal tether to the camp anchor system while resting. Stronger gusts struck the camp platform. Guy lines across multiple tents tightened audibly under wind stress, and Tycho's front line began vibrating sharply as it rubbed against its anchor. Instead of adding more anchors or securing himself inside the camp system, he tightened only one front line and lay down. Spindrift accumulated along the windward side, gradually increasing structural load and changing airflow around the tent surface. The accident occurred near the outer edge of the platform around 1:41 a.m. A strong gust struck the windward picket, which either snapped or pulled free from compacted snow. The tent shifted several feet toward the edge. As Tycho attempted to brace inside, a second powerful gust lifted the windward side. Remaining guy lines cut into softened snow under increasing tension. The tent slid over the platform lip, while Tycho, unconnected to any anchor, was carried with it. The tent tumbled downslope, briefly catching on a rock projection before continuing into a steep ice slope. The initial slide crossed the platform edge within seconds, followed by a longer, uncontrolled descent across snow and ice. Flapping fabric and cracking tent poles were heard above the wind. 2 teammates observed a headlamp glow, moving downslope before disappearing. The tent was located at first light on a lower slope section after multiple impacts. Medical evaluation indicated severe blunt force trauma to the head and neck, along with multiple fractures of the femur and ribs. No rope arrest occurred. Tycho was unresponsive when reached and showed no spontaneous breathing. The combination of traumatic injuries and extreme altitude made survival impossible. The team radioed their logistics camp immediately. High-altitude porters prepared recovery movement once daylight improved visibility. Communication was maintained through VHF radio and later relay channel. Several hours passed before safe ascent conditions allowed retrieval operations. Helicopter evacuation was impossible due to terrain and altitude. The body was secured mid-slope and lowered to the lower camp platform, then transported to the base staging area the following day. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force head and cervical spine trauma. Contributing factors included anchor failure, lack of personal tethering, and extreme camp exposure. Recovered evidence included the pulled picket, abraded guy lines, and fractured tent poles, consistent with high-impact loading. The expedition group later required multiple anchor systems and mandatory personal clip-in procedures at exposed high camps. It was September 3, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skylar Pemberton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes. Distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. It was January 24, 2026, on a high-altitude section of a remote 8,000-meter mountain, between a steep ice couloir and an exposed traverse zone. The air was extremely thin, slowing movement and decision-making, while clipped breathing echoed faintly against surrounding ice walls. Ilara Boone was 36, an intensive care nurse from a mountain city in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. Working in critical care had trained her to remain calm under pressure and respond quickly to emergencies. She approached climbing with discipline and endurance training. Teammates described her as determined once she committed to an objective. She had prior experience on a high mountain above 7,000 meters, but limited exposure to extreme altitude zones where oxygen scarcity strongly affects cognition. Her goal was to reach the summit and descend to a mid-high camp the same day. During the climb, teammates noticed early warning signs of altitude stress, including slower speech and reduced reaction speed. One teammate suggested turning back near the narrow passage beneath a massive overhanging ice structure, where exposure risk was high. Ilara chose to continue, using minimal supplemental oxygen to conserve supply for the descent. The terrain consisted of a steep ice couloir, followed by a narrow exposed traverse where protection anchors were spaced widely. Light cloud cover created flat lighting conditions, reducing depth perception and making it difficult to distinguish solid ice from thin snow layer. At extreme altitude, hypoxia impairs judgment, coordination, and reaction speed. The flat light further hid small surface irregularities that climbers normally use for secure footing. Another team had advised early retreat as cloud cover thickened. Warning signs included slower clipping movements and a brief misclip of a carabiner that required correction after a teammate's reminder. Risk increased when an oxygen cylinder swap was delayed, leaving Alara on reduced oxygen flow during a critical section. Despite assistance offers, she chose to descend under her own movement rather than use short rope support. The accident occurred near the middle of the traverse beneath the Serac. As Alara stepped to bypass an old anchor, the front points of her left crampon slid across a thin snow layer resting on hard ice. Hypoxia affected her hand control while handling the ascender. She briefly unweighted the fixed line, slid a short distance downhill, and attempted to regain grip. The ascender re-engaged at an unstable angle before detaching under load. Her ice axe failed to arrest the motion as the pick skidded across hard ice without penetrating. She slid diagonally across the slope, struck a protruding ice bulge, and continued sliding toward lower terrain near the couloir lip. The uncontrolled movement covered about 100 feet in less than 10 seconds. Scraping metal, short exhalations, and muted shouts were heard by nearby teammates. 2 climbers witnessed the fall sequence. Helmet camera footage later reviewed at base camp captured the misclip and loss of control. The impact caused head trauma, an upper arm fracture, and suspected internal bleeding. Brief involuntary convulsions were followed by agonal breathing lasting less than a minute. Severe brain injury combined with extreme altitude conditions made recovery impossible. Teammates immediately radioed the main base staging area. Communication was maintained through relay channels and satellite notification to expedition coordinators. No external rescue team could reach the site that day due to terrain exposure and avalanche risk beneath the Serac. Team members carefully moved her about 40 feet to a more protected stand. Helicopter evacuation was not feasible inside the confined ice corridor. Her body was later transported down the route during safer seasonal conditions to the base staging area. Medical review identified blunt force head trauma as the primary cause of death, with contributing factors including hypoxia-related impairment, low oxygen flow during the traverse, and flat light conditions hiding terrain edges. Recovered evidence included a damaged helmet and video footage showing the misclip sequence. The incident was briefly mentioned in specialized climbing summaries. Following the accident, expedition groups added redundant attachment systems at exposed traverse anchors to reduce single-point failure risk.
It was May 28, 2016, near the peak of Denali's climbing season, when guided expeditions were moving steadily onto the mountain during one of the year's most active weather windows. The woman who met them was Kara Harmon, legally born Carolyn Bexley. She was 34 years old, and she had already been pushed out of the formal guiding world years earlier after a pattern of professional and ethical violations that made her unfit for certification or partnership within regulated alpine guiding systems. She failed the main professional mountain guiding certification evaluations twice, including core assessments in rope management, terrain judgment, and client safety decision-making, and later attempted to reapply using altered personal details, which resulted in her applications being flagged and rejected. I've noticed reputations like that don't really need a final ban or anything official. People just quietly stop picking up your calls, stop teaming up with you, and before long you're basically outside the system without anyone ever making a big announcement about it. What followed wasn't one clear expulsion, more like a slow shutdown of access. In regional guiding circles, she built a reputation for misrepresenting qualifications and making questionable calls in changing conditions, poor descent timing, clients ending up exposed to avoidable risk. It didn't always turn into legal action, but it didn't really need to. Experienced guides and operators just stopped working with her, one by one, until there wasn't really anywhere left to plug back into. By the time she reappeared under the name Kara Harmon, she was no longer part of any legitimate guiding structure. She had built an independent operation that relied on fabricated certifications and a professional facade designed to resemble licensed guiding services, despite lacking any valid authorization. Her exclusion from the professional system was not symbolic, it was functional. She had been denied certification, refused recognition, and effectively barred from legitimate guiding pathways due to repeated misrepresentation and safety concerns, yet she continued operating in the same terrain regardless. The 19 clients were distributed across rope teams under Bexley's coordination, with 4 junior guides unevenly positioned within the system. Later investigation confirmed that none possessed the certifications or experience expected for a commercial Denali expedition. He was 41, a structural engineer for a civil contracting firm in Tacoma, married, 2 kids, and someone who'd spent years hiking the North Cascades in the Olympics. On paper, he did everything right, maybe even more than most people would, but none of that really replaces time actually moving through glaciated terrain. No rope team travel, no crampon work on ice, none of that. You only really learn it when you're there, experience. He reads like someone who did everything you're supposed to do before a trip like this, but I don't really think any of that translates to having been in that kind of terrain before. The Denali expedition was a delayed 40th birthday goal, booked through what he believed was a licensed guiding service on an outdoor activity platform. He paid $1,800. 4 coworkers joined him at the same rate. None had prior glaciated climbing experience. By all accounts, Osmond prepared carefully. He completed a 1-day crampon clinic 6 weeks prior, purchased appropriate technical gear, and repeatedly reviewed provided checklists and instructional materials. His wife later described a methodical approach, guidebooks, training videos, and multiple clarification calls to the booking service, each met with procedural reassurance. He had done everything the listing instructed. And I think that's the part that always sticks with me. He followed the checklist exactly the way most people would. And there's a kind of trust in that that feels completely reasonable until you realize the checklist isn't the mountain. That fact would later be treated not as a detail, but as a structural failure, the gap between procedural compliance and actual mountain competence. A second group of 7 participants came through a now defunct Facebook hiking community in the Seattle area. Their ages ranged from mid-20s to mid-50s and reflected a broad mix of professions including healthcare, education, retail, and logistics. One retired postal worker from Federal Way 64 described the climb as a long-considered milestone. Communication with the guide occurred entirely through text and a single brief group video call. A third group of 7 was assembled through a corporate wellness program at a mid-sized insurance firm in Bellevue. The company contracted what it believed was a licensed and insured commercial guiding operation for a team-building expedition. None had technical climbing experience beyond recreational indoor activity. 19 people, 3 different booking paths, and 1 guide operating under a maid identity, no valid credentials, and no actual authorization to lead a glaciated ascent like that. In the parking area that evening, Bexley distributed a single-page safety briefing adapted from unrelated Pacific Northwest climbing materials and not fully revised for the expedition. It included references to non-existent or misattributed landmarks, such as Fumarole Flat and Hot Rocks Camp, carried over from Mount St. Helens materials. None of the 19 clients identified the errors. I don't really blame them for missing it. In that kind of setting, most people assume the paperwork has already been checked by someone who knows what they're doing. She also issued self-drafted liability waivers that had not been reviewed by legal counsel and contained provisions unlikely to be enforceable under standard commercial guiding regulations. Clients signed without scrutiny, treating the process as routine intake. One participant, Marcus Stull, noted the group size discrepancy, 19 instead of the expected 8. Bexley attributed it to merged bookings and assured the route could accommodate larger spacing. Stull did not escalate the concern. Another client, Trevor Nast, requested credentials. Bexley presented a laminated AMGA-style card under the name Kara Harmon, which Nast photographed but did not verify. It was later determined to be counterfeit. Some of them did question it, at least briefly. The group size felt off, the paperwork didn't really line up, and a few people asked direct questions about credentials. But every time it came up, she brushed it off quickly, talked over it, leaned on the laminated card, kept repeating that everything was properly licensed and standard for bigger alpine groups, and when someone hesitated, it usually ended the same way. The conversation just moved on before it had a chance to turn into a real decision point. Gerald Fenwick disclosed a recent minor cardiac event and hypertension, but stated he had medical clearance. No documentation was collected, and no formal medical screening was conducted. Gear checks were completed through visual inspection, confirming required equipment. Waivers were collected and retained. Departure was scheduled for the following morning, following air transport onto the glacier. That night, weather conditions at valley level were calm. Some participants reviewed generally favorable forecasts, though limited detail was available for high elevation conditions. Others others contacted family or posted preparatory updates. After the staging area cleared out, Bexley looked over a printed topo map showing the West Buttress approach on Denali. The route choice was intentional. It avoided the standard guided corridor where most regulated traffic is tracked and managed. She didn't hold any permit or authorization for commercial guiding in glaciated terrain. None of the required structure that normally governs that kind of operation.
When I look at choices like that, I usually think about how easy it is to mistake operating outside the system for experience, especially on terrain where that system exists because people have already been hurt without it.
The route moves into remote Alaska Range terrain on Denali, where weather systems develop rapidly and conditions transition into sustained glaciated exposure above 10,000 feet. It is a heavily crevassed and avalanche-prone environment shaped by constant alpine instability and shifting ice formations. In the days before the climb, Denali experienced a destabilizing freeze-thaw cycle. Late warming weakened internal snow structure through melt penetration, followed by rapid refreezing that formed a hard surface crust over unstable layers, a condition that can conceal deeper structural failure within the snowpack. A large ice formation documented days earlier on the upper route showed signs of basal fracture and progressive instability. It circulated informally among climbers, though no formal report was filed. Bexley's route plan, later recovered, passed beneath this serac band with an estimated clearance of about 60 feet. Standard practice for a feature of that size calls for a buffer of several hundred feet due to potential collapse and debris spread. Her notes contained no mitigation or alternative route adjustments. The group departed the glacier landing zone shortly after first light on Denali. Conditions in the lower basin were cold and overcast, with a low cloud ceiling drifting across the lower Alaska Range and obscuring sections of the mountain above. 19 clients entered the glacier system under Bexley's supervision, accompanied by 4 junior guides whose qualifications and experience were later found to be substantially below commercial expedition standards. The early route passed through broad glaciated valley terrain and exposed moraine fields, typical of Denali's lower approach. Visibility was limited beyond the immediate travel line due to cloud cover and flat light. Glacial melt channels and wind-carved ice features bordered sections of the route. Conditions were stable, and the group moved through the lower terrain without incident. With increasing elevation, the terrain shifted from moraine into broken ice field, and then into more exposed alpine glaciated ground. The pace started to slow with the size of the group and the mix of fitness levels. Rest stops stretched out a bit longer each time people regrouped. By late morning, they were already behind the original schedule.
Nothing unsafe yet, but I've seen how these kind of delays quietly shrink the margin you're relying on later without anyone really noticing it happening in real time.
In the mid to upper approach zone, one participant, Phil Renner, started reporting early altitude symptoms: headache, mild nausea. He took medication and kept going after checking in with Bexley. It was noted, but there wasn't a real change in pace or a decision to turn around or reset at that point. The group reached Camp 3 at approximately 14,200 feet in the early evening, later than they'd planned. Above Camp 3, the route continued toward High Camp at approximately 17,200 feet, the final staging point before summit attempts on Denali's upper west buttress. The weather kept shifting, brief, clear breaks where the upper mountain actually came into view across the Alaska Range, then clouds again, swallowing it up. Even from camp, the summit still looked far away, broken into sections across the upper face, but clearly still a long way off. While camp was being established, the schedule for moving higher on the mountain was pushed back again because of the earlier delays. What was supposed to be a midnight departure turned into something later. It doesn't sound like much on paper, but it quietly eats into the buffer you really want up there, especially when timing and surface conditions matter that much. That night it got properly cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing, wind picked up, and sleep didn't really come easily for most people. Some were just lying there, awake for hours. Renner still wasn't feeling right, and a few others were dealing with their own minor issues, taking whatever personal meds they had with them just to get through the night. The following morning, the expedition departed Camp 3 and continued toward the upper mountain, beginning the next stage of the West Buttress ascent. The departure occurred occurred in darkness and cold from approximately 14,200 feet. Temperatures were in the low 20s Fahrenheit, with steady wind moving across the glacier. Cloud cover had returned overnight, limiting visibility to the range of headlamp. Beyond that immediate circle of light, the upper mountain was not visible in any defined form, only an upward slope of terrain. As the group gained elevation onto the upper glacier and ridge system on Denali, terrain conditions transitioned into steeper glaciated slopes. The surface consisted of refrozen snow over softer internal layers, creating inconsistent footing. Crampon technique became critical for stability on the incline. Brief instruction on front point use was provided early in the ascent, though not uniformly across all teams. As a result, technique consistency varied between participants as the slope steepened and visibility remained limited. At approximately 14,800 feet, movement slowed on rope team 2 when one participant, Gerald Fenwick, began to lag. The rope compressed as the team adjusted spacing. He was encouraged to continue and did so. The ascent resumed without a change in overall formation or pace structure. Higher on the route, the group encountered a steep ice step of roughly 20 feet in height. Bexley led the first team over the feature, established a temporary protection point at the top, and brought the remaining clients up individually using a belay system. The process required extended time to complete due to group size, and by its conclusion, daylight was beginning to increase. By the time the entire group had cleared the step, the schedule had fallen significantly behind the planned timeline for the upper mountain. The delay reduced available time margins for the remainder of the ascent, where conditions are typically more dependent on early timing.
I usually pay attention to delays like that because they never really feel serious when they happen, but I've seen enough trips where they quietly pile up, and suddenly you're making decisions with way less time and energy than you thought you had.
From above the step, the upper route and the Serac band on the eastern shoulder of the ridge system came into partial view in the early light. It looked stable, almost clean from that distance, like it was just sitting there in place. From below, it still lined up directly with the planned ascent line. Bexley elected to continue along the original route. The decision was made with knowledge of the feature's presence from the planning map, but without additional updated hazard information beyond what was visible from the slope at that time. The group moved into the upper snowfield as the angle steepened to about 42 degrees. 3 rope teams stretched across the slope, lead team up high, second team in the middle, third still climbing up from below. It turned into a steady rhythm of movement. Step, plant the axe, reset the feet, step again, over and over. No real pause in it anymore. At that angle, mistakes don't really stay small. They don't stay small at all. A slip becomes a pull becomes a chain reaction through the rope. On refrozen snow especially, where it feels solid but isn't really solid underneath, even a slight misstep can carry through the whole system faster than anyone can recover. Around 15,300 feet, Bexley placed a snow picket and anchored rope team 1. The plan, as reflected in her route notes, was to bring the lead team to a flatter section near approximately 13,350 feet to reassess conditions. Standard practice for a feature of that size and instability profile calls for a substantially wider buffer zone due to potential collapse and debris spread, typically measured in several hundred feet. At approximately 15,280 feet, Phil Renner came to a stop on rope team 1. The halt was not preceded by any coordinated signal or planned pause. His condition, consistent with progressing altitude illness, had deteriorated during the ascent. He exhibited confusion and loss of coherent movement, and later stated he did not immediately recognize his location or situation. He remained attached to the rope system in the third position on the lead team. His stop caused tension to transfer through the rope line. Rope team 2, still ascending below, closed distance toward team 1 as spacing compressed on the slope. Within a short interval, the two teams were brought within close proximity on the same incline, reducing separation between groups to roughly 20 feet in places. No additional intermediate anchors were established between them during this period. By this point, movement was occurring on exposed, steep glaciated terrain on Denali's upper west buttress route, with limited secure anchoring between rope teams. Progress depended entirely on individual crampon placement and ice axe stability on a variable refrozen surface.
I'd be a lot more concerned about the accumulation of little compromises than any single decision. The delayed schedule, the compressed rope teams, the lack of intermediate anchors, none of them exist in isolation anymore.
The group remained below and to the southeast of the Sarek Band, now fully visible in morning light several hundred feet above, positioned along the adjacent to the west buttress route line. From that position, fracture patterns at the base of the ice shelf were discernible to trained observers as signs of structural stress, but the team continued along the planned line with no documented change in route or objective.
When I read that they stayed on the planned line, I don't hear stubbornness as much as I hear how hard it is to step off a plan when the terrain still looks normal enough to justify it.
A shear failure propagated along a pre-existing stress plane in the ice shelf above the eastern shoulder of the west buttress route. The fracture extended across the full width of the shelf within seconds, resulting in complete detachment. The ice mass, estimated at between 800,000 and 1,100,000 pounds, dropped roughly 12 feet before striking the snowfield below. The impact distributed force laterally across a wide zone, producing secondary debris ranging from small ice fragments to blocks approaching 40 pounds, spreading downslope beyond the primary impact area. Of the 24 members of the expedition on the slope at the time, 14 clients and 4 junior guides were positioned within the area, later reconstructed as the primary impact and debris field. The force of the initial impact was sufficient to displace anchors and equipment under significant load. The snow picket placed by Bexley as the anchor for Rope Team 2 failed under the transmitted force traveling through the rope system.
She was unqualified. Honestly, unqualified to the point where calling it a guiding role doesn't really fit what was happening out there.
The placement had been set in relatively unconsolidated snow and at a suboptimal angle, reducing its holding strength. Under the sudden load, the picket was extracted from the snowpack, removing the only effective anchor for that team. Rope Team 2 immediately transitioned into an uncontrolled fall. 7 of the 8 members of Rope Team 2 went down together, all of them, basically at once, sliding roughly 200 feet across that 42-degree slope on the upper west buttress. It's a long way to fall like that, a long, fast, uncontrolled drop, especially on mixed snow like that. As they picked up speed, it just kept building faster and faster. A few of them lost their ice axes almost immediately in the initial chaos, just couldn't hold on to them. And once that happens on that kind of slope, there's really nothing to arrest the fall anymore. No recovery, no reset, just momentum carrying everything downhill. The descending team then struck Rope Team 3, still ascending below. The collision destabilized multiple climbers, causing 4 of 6 members to fall, some directly impacted, others pulled off balance through rope and terrain force transmission. Above them, Bexley and 2 adjacent clients on Rope Team 1 were not hit by the main ice mass, but were affected by secondary debris. Bexley's snow picket briefly held before failing as load propagated through the system. The 2 clients below her were pulled downslope before the system fully failed. Bexley fell last, approximately 11 seconds after the initial collapse. In the immediate aftermath, there were no confirmed uninjured survivors from the ascent party. Emergency services received the signal shortly after and initiated coordinated air and ground response, though access was delayed by terrain and weather constraints. A separate climber, located higher on the route, was later located unresponsive after becoming incapacitated by altitude illness and exposure. The majority of victims fell between roughly 400 and 650 feet across steep snow, ice, and rock transitions on Denali's upper slopes, with some carried onto the upper glacier surface. Bexley's fall ended against a rock band at approximately 10,600 feet, where she was pronounced deceased. All 24 individuals present on the ascent, 19 clients, 4 junior guides, and Bexley died as a result of the event. 14 were killed during the initial fall sequence or from immediate impact trauma, while the remaining deaths occurred shortly afterward due to exposure, injury progression, or a combination of both before rescue access was possible. The PLB signal was received by an air coordination center and relayed to Park Dispatch shortly afterward. Aerial reconnaissance later that morning confirmed multiple stationary figures across a debris field spanning roughly 600 feet on the upper glacier approach. Weather and terrain delayed both air and ground response, and operations shifted from rescue to recovery within hours, continuing over subsequent days. Autopsies attributed 14 deaths to blunt force trauma consistent with a high energy fall, 3 to combined trauma and exposure, and 2 primarily to traumatic brain injury. Bexley died from massive blunt force trauma following following a high-velocity impact. Toxicology results were negative. A criminal investigation recovered a counterfeit guide certification, a consumer-grade laminator, operational records, client payment logs totaling approximately $35,000, and evidence of activity under multiple identifiers, with no valid commercial guiding authorization found under any name used. A formal review concluded the incident resulted from cascading operational failures under an unqualified guiding operation on Denali, including excessive group size, inadequate rope system management, insufficient anchoring, and lack of qualified multi-team leadership. While the Serac collapse was identified as the triggering event, investigators determined that standard guided expedition protocols would likely have prevented a mass fatality under the same conditions.